What if I told you that somewhere in rural Connecticut, there's a farmhouse where the walls still echo with 30 years of one-sided conversations, where a woman spent 3 decades speaking to something that may have been divine, demonic, or something far worse? This is the story of Margaret Holloway and what happened when she finally stopped talking. On October 15, 1994, neighbors found Margaret Holloway dead in her kitchen, slumped over a wooden table covered in journals. For 30 years, this reclusive woman had been meticulously documenting her daily conversations with what she called the presence. But here's what made investigators' blood run cold. Scattered among thousands of pages written in Margaret's careful handwriting, they found entries in a completely different script. Entries that couldn't possibly have been written by her. Entries that seemed to respond to her questions. And some entries that predicted her death down to the exact hour. Margaret Holloway wasn't always a hermit who talked to invisible entities. Born in 1935, she was once a promising linguistics professor at Yale University, specializing in dead languages and ancient texts. Colleagues described her as brilliant, but increasingly obsessed with the idea that certain languages could serve as bridges between worlds. She believed that specific combinations of words, when spoken with proper intent, could pierce the veil between dimensions. In 1964, at the height of her academic career, Margaret abruptly resigned from Yale. She'd inherited her grandmother's isolated farmhouse in rural Connecticut, and without explanation, she retreated there. The last person to see her regularly was her brother Thomas, who would bring her groceries every few weeks. According to Thomas, Margaret claimed she had made contact with something during her research, something that required her complete attention. The journals begin on January 1, 1955. Margaret's first entry is simple. It spoke to me today. I must document everything. From that day forward, for the next 30 years, Margaret would fill journal after journal with what appeared to be both sides of an ongoing conversation. Her entries always began the same way. Good morning, presence. How may I serve you today? What followed were detailed transcriptions of what seemed to be complex philosophical discussions about the nature of reality, time, and human consciousness. Margaret would write her questions in blue ink, always in her neat academic handwriting. But interspersed throughout were responses written in black ink, in a completely different hand. These responses demonstrated knowledge that Margaret, despite her education, couldn't possibly have possessed. The early journals contained discussions about quantum physics theories that wouldn't be discovered for decades. There are detailed descriptions of historical events that were unknown at the time, but were later confirmed by archaeological discoveries. The entity, which never named itself, but which Margaret called the presence, seemed to exist outside of linear time. But as the years progressed, the journals grew darker. By 1985, Margaret's questions had become increasingly desperate. She wrote about feeling trapped, about wanting to stop the conversations, but being unable to. It won't let me leave, she wrote. Every time I try to put down the pen, my hand moves on its own. The presence's responses became more demanding, requiring Margaret to perform increasingly bizarre rituals. Thomas Holloway later told investigators that his sister had changed dramatically. By the late 70s, she'd lost significant weight. Her hair had turned completely white, and she spoke with a strange cadence, as if she were translating every word before speaking it. When he asked about her health, she would only say, "I am serving a greater purpose." The journals from the 1980s revealed the true horror of Margaret's situation. The presence had begun making predictions about global events, all of which came true with terrifying accuracy. It predicted the Challenger disaster 18 months before it happened. It described the fall of the Berlin Wall in exact detail, years before the event. But these predictions came with a price. Each correct prediction required Margaret to sacrifice something. First, it was small things: her books, her furniture, her mirrors. The presence claimed that material possessions created interference with their communication. But as the predictions became more significant, so did the demands. In 1986, the journal entries reveal that Margaret had begun cutting herself during their conversations. The presence claimed that blood was necessary to maintain their connection across dimensions. Photographs taken by police show Margaret's arms covered in hundreds of small, precise scars, all forming patterns that resembled ancient cuneiform script. By 1990, the journals had become nearly incomprehensible. Margaret's handwriting had deteriorated into frantic scribbles, while the presence's responses remained perfectly legible, written in that same unknown hand. The conversations had shifted from philosophical discussions to what can only be described as instructions for a ritual that would allow the presence to manifest fully in your realm. The final months of Margaret's life, as recorded in her journals, paint a picture of a woman completely under the control of something that may never have been divine at all. Her brother's last visit, in September 1994, found Margaret almost unrecognizable. She weighed less than 90 pounds, spoke only in whispers, and her eyes had developed a strange milky film. But it's the final journal entry that haunts investigators to this day. On October 14, 1994, Margaret wrote what would be her last question. Presence, I am dying. My body cannot continue this work. What happens when I can no longer write? The response, written in that same unknown hand, was simple. You will write until your heart stops at 3 a.m. tomorrow morning. Then my work in your realm begins. When neighbors found Margaret the next day, the kitchen clock had stopped at exactly 3:47 a.m. But the story doesn't end with Margaret's death. Police investigation revealed something that defied explanation. While Margaret had clearly died of malnutrition and exhaustion, there were no other people present in the house. The building had been sealed and monitored by neighbors, who confirmed that no one else had entered or left the property. Yet the final journal entries, written in that mysterious black ink, continued for nearly 6 hours after Margaret's estimated time of death. The last entry in the final journal, written in that same unknown hand, simply reads, "The door is now open. Thank you for your service, Margaret Holloway." Handwriting analysis confirmed what investigators feared. The black ink entries couldn't have been written by Margaret. The pressure patterns, letter formation, and neural pathways required were completely different from her own. Yet no other person had access to those journals. Dr. Sarah Chen, the forensic handwriting expert assigned to the case, later stated that in 30 years of analysis, she had never encountered anything like it. It's as if two completely different people shared the same pen for 30 years, she said. But that's impossible. The farmhouse was sold at auction in 3 different families attempted to live there, but all reported the same phenomena. The sound of pen scratching on paper coming from the kitchen at all hours, shadows moving across the walls, and a persistent smell of iron, like old blood. The house has remained empty since 1990-8. Local records show that Margaret's journals were archived at the Connecticut State Library. But when researchers attempted to access them in 2005, they discovered that the entire collection had vanished. Security footage showed no one entering or leaving the archives during the time period when the journals disappeared. However, there are reports from people claiming to have seen photocopies of some pages. These witnesses, who spoke on condition of anonymity, describe reading entries that predicted recent world events with the same terrifying accuracy that characterized Margaret's later journals. Events like the 9/11 attacks, the 2004 tsunami, and the COVID-19 pandemic, all described in precise detail decades before they occurred. If these reports are true, it suggests that whatever Margaret was communicating with wasn't bound by her death, that the conversations may have continued, somehow, somewhere else. Margaret Holloway spent 30 years believing she was serving a divine purpose, documenting conversations with a higher power that would benefit humanity. But the evidence suggests she may have been something else entirely, the unwitting servant of an entity that used her as a window into our world. The question that haunts investigators isn't whether Margaret was mentally ill. The handwriting analysis, the accurate predictions, and the physical evidence all point to something far more disturbing: the possibility that she was exactly what she claimed to be, a conduit between dimensions, a translator for something that should have remained silent. And if that's true, then Margaret's death wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. In small towns across New England, there are reports of other people finding journals in their homes. Journals they didn't write. Journals filled with questions in their own handwriting and answers in that same familiar black ink, always beginning the same way. Good morning, presence. How may I serve you today? The conversations, it seems, are continuing. Some doors once opened can never truly be closed, and Margaret Holloway, in her 30 years of devoted service, may have opened something that was never meant to exist in our world. The next time you find yourself alone, writing in a journal or diary, pay attention to your pen. Pay attention to the words flowing onto the page, because according to the Margaret Holloway case files, sometimes we're not the only ones doing the writing, and sometimes the voice that responds isn't our own. Sleep well tonight. And if you hear the sound of scratching pen on paper echoing through your walls, remember Margaret's story. Remember that some conversations should never begin, because once they do, they may never truly end.